So welcome to our Aspiring Psychological Professions Community of Practice meeting, which this evening is on the topic of reflection. Shall we have the next slide? I'm Maggie Rosario. I am the chair of the East of England Psychological Professions Network. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Green. I'm a senior assistant psychologist. I work with Maggie at the East of England Psychological Professions Network, and I'm also a psychological wellbeing practitioner with our Talking Therapies digital team.
Thank you, Laura. And Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Emily Ashton. I've recently started as a senior assistant psychologist in the PPN and the Talking Therapies digital team.
Thank you, Emily. Shall we have the next slide? So we also have a really fantastic steering group who help us plan these meetings and keep us on track with everything that we're doing. And the next slide. So the agenda for this evening. We have Laura is going to talk us through the feedback that we got from our steering group when we asked them about reflection and their thoughts on reflection. Then Richard, we're really pleased to have you here today. Richard is going to talk to us about reflection and its importance and introduce us to that topic. Then Natalia is going to talk about self-practice, self-reflection and do an exercise with us, which is great. And then there will be a chance for questions. Do put your questions in the chat as we're going through. We really welcome them and hopefully we'll have time to answer as many of them as we possibly can. And then at the end, we would really like it if you would complete a feedback form. The feedback forms really help us shape our sessions going forward. So do complete them, please. And then we'll talk about the next meeting and then we'll close. Shall we have the next slide? OK, so these are the ground rules for our meeting. We're recording it, as you know. Please keep your microphone on mute and your cameras off. This is a safe space that's confidential and respectful, non-judgmental and non-pressured. We hope that it will be a supportive space. That's really important to us. So please do bear those principles in mind when you're asking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
So, go ahead, Laura.
So I'm going to talk through the themes that came up. So before we do one of these sessions, we always ask our steering group what they might want to cover in the session. So for this one, there were quite a few themes around the structure of reflective practice. So, for example, can it be done alone or is it facilitated? How long does it need to last? And how often should we practice reflection? Then there were also some comments about reflective models. We did include a link to these models on the Eventbrite page. So if you haven't already had a look at those models, I would definitely recommend that would be a good starting point. There were a few themes around the benefits of reflection. So the benefits generally and how this might be different in a group setting or if we're reflecting alone. And also how can reflection help to improve well-being? Then there were some more themes around the nature of reflection. So does it focus on what we've done wrong or can it be more positive? And also relating to this point, healthy reflection versus destructive introspection, which is quite an interesting point about getting the balance right, increasing self-awareness, but also taking on board learning points without becoming too self-critical. So to summarise broadly, the themes cover some of the practical aspects, like how reflection is structured, the benefits of reflection, and how to get started. So I'll hand over to Richard now to give us an introduction to reflection, and we can start to cover some of these themes in more detail.
Should I share my own slides? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just stop sharing now, Richard.
Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Richard.
Right, okay, so you can see those. So I'm going to talk a bit about reflection, and then I'll talk a slight bit about self-practice and self-reflection. Hopefully, I won't be going too much into what Natalia is going to cover, but what I will say is the best way to learn about self-practice and self-reflection is by an exercise, so it's great that you're going to have a chance to do that later on. So, but I'll kind of do a general introduction to reflection, and then hopefully segue into SPSR before handing over to Natalia. So, my background, so I'm a clinical psychologist and a CBT psychotherapist, and I work in NIAP service up in Cumbria, so the opposite end of England for most of you. And I'm also editor of TCBT, which is one of my main interests. So some of you may have read articles in there. I know this thing we'll talk about later, self-practice, self-reflection, which is a training methodology really emphasizing reflection. I've been researching that since 2002. So hopefully I'll answer some of the points that have been mentioned as themes. That was the first time I've seen those, but some really, really good points. So hopefully I'll mention some, and I'm sure Natalia mentioned some, and we can answer any questions later on. So some definitions before we go on, because reflection, sometimes the more you think about it, the more of a kind of amorphous concept it can seem. So I think it's really important to be clear what we're talking about. So first of all, reflection as a process. I think it's important to think about that meaning of reflection. So this process of actively focusing your own attention on a particular content, observing this, clarifying what this focus actually is, and then using a range of knowledge that you're bringing in, that you've got, and other cognitive processes to derive a kind of conceptualization of what this actually is, and then to lead to new understandings. And when we talk about self-reflection, we're talking about a very specific form of reflection in which the reflection is self-reference to our own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or personal history. And you can get people who are very, very reflective, but have real blind spots around self-reflection. So the two don't always come together. And often it's easier to focus in general than it is at self-reflection. I mean, I'll talk about a really good example of that in a moment. But yeah, that's a subsection of wider reflection. And some of you might know Donald Schoen's work, but I just think these are really, really nice concepts to think about. So he talks about reflection on action. So that's when the action's already been interrupted or it's already happened and you're reflecting back on something that's already happened. And then reflection in action, which is when you reflect on the action as you're doing it without interrupting it. So to make that, so if you think about that as if you're doing a therapy session, for example, if you do a therapy session, then you sit and do reflective form afterwards, so you're sitting in supervision and you're reflecting on what happened, that would be reflection on action. And that's much, much easier when you're learning something new. In fact, it's much, much easier in general. And reflection in action is when you do that during the session. So as you're doing the session, you notice without interrupting the session that you've got a bunch of options. You're actually conceptualizing something as you go along. You're making decisions as you go along. That's much, much harder. And he would see reflection in action as a much later stage of development. But just to move away from, I mean, my examples here are all around therapy, because although I'm a clinical psychologist, I've basically been doing CBT for a long time. So that's all my examples are around that. But here's a chance just to think about a non-work setting. So think about a hobby or an interest you've got where you've got a moderate level of competence, and it could be anything. It could be baking, it could be baking bread, baking cakes, it could be photography, it could be painting. It's worth thinking about how you developed those skills. Because I remember years ago, we were doing a project, it was a self-practice, self-reflection project with some psychologists, and there was a panel of people, and one of the guys on the panel who wasn't particularly reflective had this kind of little outburst saying, why do psychologists have to reflect? Plumbers don't have to reflect. Why do psychologists have to reflect? Why do therapists have to reflect? And he was wrong for a range of reasons, because firstly, it's slightly different interpersonal process if you're a therapist or a clinical psychologist. But actually, I would argue that good plumbers, effective plumbers, actually do need to reflect to be able to do their job. So if you think about any skill that involves conceptualizing a task and coming to new solutions, it would require reflection. So a plumber who's just doing the same job day in, day out, just like somebody doing any task day in, day out, would not need to reflect. But somebody who's going to be faced with tasks that might be different to others, that might need to draw on previous knowledge and experience, that might need to conceptualize something, they would need to reflect. So I think it was a mistake to think that I wouldn't want a plumber that wasn't reflective coming to solve plumbing issues in my house. But have a think about the hobbies that you've got, the interests you've got. So for me, my main interest is photography. So if I am looking at photos I've taken, and working out either technically or compositionally how they could have been better, that's reflection on action. But if I'm actually got the camera to my eye and I'm actually taking a photo and I'm visualizing other compositions and I'm changing settings, but I'm still taking the photo, that's reflection in action. And most people who've got a degree of competence will do both of those. And often it's easier to think about an area where you've got a higher level of skill than something that you're still learning. So why do we think reflection is important? So these are the characteristics of master therapists, and you'll see a range of them, from tolerance of ambiguity, openness to change, cultural competence. Really key one is reflective practice, that ability to reflect. And there are a range of studies that show that therapists can be effective with straightforward, easy patients without a relatively high degree of reflection. But as soon as you've got patients that are slightly more difficult or more challenging, or they're not doing exactly what you would like easily, or they're difficult to engage, or there's a degree of complexity, the therapist with higher reflective skills are more effective. And that's been found in PWPs. It's been found in clinical psychologists. It's just basically a factor around any kind of complexity in a task. You do need that reflective ability. So to be a master therapist, to be a master clinical psychologist or whatever, a master plumber, you need to be able to reflect. Obviously more so where there's interpersonal tasks. And some of you may have seen these from the kind of Rothman Billing competence documents, and they talk a lot about meta competences, the things that you need that aren't specific, disorder specific. They're not modality specific, but they work across a range of levels, and reflective skills would be one of those. So why do we think that it's central in terms of therapist development, clinical psychologist development? So firstly, as a way of benefiting from training, and that could be core training, but it could also be ongoing CPD. So we know, for example, that people benefit from different types of training for different skills. So if you want to learn didactic knowledge, reading a book might be okay, but there is research. If you want to learn a task with interpersonal aspects to it, there are certain ways of training. It might be self-practice, self-reflection, it might be role plays, it might be modeling. There are certain ways of training that target certain skills, and reflection is useful in most of those. Clinical supervision. So most of you who've had clinical supervision will know that this is a time where you're expected to reflect both on personal content and on what's happened during earlier sessions. So to get the most out of clinical supervision, reflection's really, really key. And another one, to be able to disembed from interpersonal processes and not get pulled into behaving in less helpful ways. So thinking about therapy as a process, and people coming into therapy with interpersonal patterns, sometimes more entrenched, more stuck. And what you notice is that therapists who are less reflective find themselves being drawn into the patient's interpersonal patterns and responding to them rather than stepping back and noticing those patterns and being able to comment on them and discuss them with the patient. There's not a great deal written about self-supervision, but we've started to write about it, thinking about if you get supervision once a week, once a month, whatever it is, how do you learn to self-supervise? How do you learn to step back and engage that reflective processes on your own without necessarily the questions that might come from your supervisor? And this next one's really, really important. Being able to reflect on your own positionality, your own socio-cultural influences, and how these impact on a therapy and supervision. Because just as this is a community of practice, one of the community of practices that I'm involved in up in the north, we've got an anti-racist community of practice, and that involves people splitting out into caucuses. So there's a caucus of people who identify as white, and there's a caucus of people who identify as from a minoritized ethnicity. And the reflection that goes on in those two caucuses, fascinating that the processes are very, very different. The content is extremely different. The engagement styles is very, very different. It's probably too detailed to get into here, but I guess we know there's research coming out every week that looks at how people's own ethnicity and experiences of racism, for example, may influence what gets talked about or not talked about in therapy or in supervision. If you're going to be, if you're a white therapist and white supervisor, supervising somebody from a minoritized ethnicity, there are certain tasks that you would need to do to be able to reflect on your own racial identity. So obviously think about the whole range of intersectionality here, but being able to reflect on our own positionality is obviously something that gives us that awareness, both in therapy, supervision and training. Being able to use client feedback, obviously reflecting on what we're hearing back from patients, whether in the session or in patient experience questionnaires, is really, really key. And in other areas, think about reflective skills within the delivery of training. So there's not many tasks as a therapist or a clinical psychologist that don't benefit from reflective skills, particularly when they get a little bit more complicated. And so this is just, I'm just going to put this all up and talk you through it. So I won't go into the model. This comes from one of the most cited models of therapist skill development called the DPR model, Declarative Procedural Reflective Model. But it basically talks about different types of knowledge. So declarative knowledge is the kind of knowledge you could read in a book. Procedural skills is knowing what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And the reflective system is that ability to engage and reflect on content. So the reflective system doesn't have content to it. You would actually kind of almost like use that to engage knowledge and skills. So what we know is that people can get to a certain point with declarative knowledge, procedural skills, and these becoming more advanced is what makes people into master therapists. And that reflective system is particularly key for ongoing procedural skill development. So, for example, think of a really, really basic task of therapy of CBT, asking somebody to fill in a thought diary. You often see people that aren't trained as CBT therapists saying, oh, I gave this person a thought diary, and what they basically done is just handed the thought diary to the person and told them to fill it in. But somebody with more developed procedural skills around that would know that actually it's incredibly anxiety provoking filling in a thought diary for the first time. It requires a set of abilities to be able to reflect on your own emotions and your own thoughts. You might have to address fears or anxieties about the thought diary being discovered, about what it might mean to the person. So there's a whole range of procedural skills that would be involved in this, knowing how to do this, how to engage, and obviously if patients that are more challenging, those procedural skills are even more essential. So the reflective system is that system that allows those procedural skills to be developed through supervision, through training, and reflected on after you've implemented something, and then learn from them so you do it differently and better in the future. So that's a brief introduction to reflection. I will just do a few more slides before I pass on to Natalia about self-practice, self-reflection. So for a long time, Judith Beck and Dad Tim Beck have both been very clear that actually gaining experience of CBT from the inside by practicing it on yourself before doing it with patients is really, really important. And even back in '95, Judith Beck was saying that you need to actually, try techniques on yourself, put them yourself in that position, read through the self materials that you do with the patient, actually practice any of the exercises, see how it feels. So there is a background, a theoretical background to this. So what it basically means, self-practice is basically practicing an aspect of therapy on ourselves, and it could be anything. It could be using an assessment tool, so it could be filling in a certain measure and then reflecting on that experience of it. It could be reading certain self-help materials. It could be including thought diaries. Usually it is something a bit more active than that. So it's usually, for example, doing your own behavioral experiment, formulating your own experience, but it can literally be anything. And obviously it needs to be fit to the task. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And self-reflection is reflecting on the experience. So I noticed one of the questions was, what form should reflection take? How structured should it be? I'll just talk you through this first. So we have tried a range of ways in self-practice, self-reflection. So we've tried with a structure, and then people have said, oh, this is too structured, I want it less structured. And then whenever we've tried it less structured, people have struggled more. So I would tend to, with self-practice, self-reflection, go down a more structured route. People can be as creative as they want within that structure, but I would tend to do it in a certain order. Firstly, it gives you a structure to reflect on, but also it helps you internalize that structure to use in the future. So the questions we would ask after an experience of self-practice would be clarifying the experience. What did I feel? How did I feel? What did I notice? And somebody's question earlier was, what about reflecting on, does it have to be where things went wrong? Can it be where things went right? We would encourage people to suspend judgment to start with and focus on whatever it is without rushing to judgment. but you could pick a situation, if you were not in SPSR, but if you reflected on a session, there's just as much of value in reflecting on one that went well as there is one that didn't go well. And for many people, reflecting when things go well can be equally uncomfortable. So yeah, you can reflect on any content, but in SPSR, you'd reflect on your self-practice. What did I notice? Then you might get into what was helpful, what didn't shift, what didn't change, what did change. So you get a little bit more deeper into that experience. Then we get people thinking, okay, and we'd ask direct questions around this, whether in a written form or if we were doing it in a group. What's the implications of what I've experienced today for my clinical practice? What am I going to take away from this that I'm going to do differently with patients? And this is a really, really key question, because when people do SPSR, they have these amazingly powerful experiences, kind of real aha moments, both because they make changes themselves, but also because they learn something quite important about therapy. But often the excitement and the emotion kind of ends there. And what we want people to think is, okay, well, what will I actually do differently with patients after this? When will I know when I need to do it? How will I do it differently? So to try and get people to really focus in on the task and make it as detailed as possible. Otherwise, it can get forgotten with the excitement of the experience. So then we ask people to think about, well, what does this tell us about how I see myself? Do I see myself any differently, either my personal self or my therapist self? And then what's the implications of this experience for my understanding of cognitive therapy? So we tend to keep to this structure. And if we do, for example, some of the workbooks we use, we may vary the wording of the question so it doesn't get repetitive, but we would tend to keep the same structure. And we've come to this structure over a period of quite a long time, having experimented with people having blank pages and just choosing how to do it, and people don't seem to get as much out of it. So there's different ways you can do SPSR, and I'll give you a flavour of one after this. So it's been doing this co-therapist method with people alternating between role of therapist and patient. We've obviously written up the workbooks, so some therapists go and do the workbooks on their own, and anybody could do that if they wanted to. Some people choose to be supported in clinical supervision with it, still doing it on their own. We've had a bunch of people doing it with colleagues, but what most of our research is around is people doing it as a group, either as a post-qualification task with work colleagues, or doing it whilst they're training. So I won't kind of go over this in too much detail, but this is just to give you an idea of the different types of self-practice tasks. So you could have, if you think about this top line here, this line here. So you could have somebody who, when they're doing teaching, gets people to practice a one-off exercise, and that's could be just to help improve people's procedural skills around it. And then you could have somebody doing the same in supervision. And there might be two reasons why you might do it in supervision. One, you might do it so the person learns the procedural skills. So the person might, for example, say, well, let's do a behavioral experiment around a hyperventilation experiment with the patient. They might practice hyperventilation experiment on themselves. It could be to learn procedural skills, but it could be to work on a therapy interfering belief that the therapist's got. So the next kind of level up would be a series of connected CBT tasks. And then we've got the workbook, and then we've got doing it as a co-therapy way, which is much more intensive. I'm not saying any of these are better or worse than others, but there's just different ways you can bring self-practice tasks into learning. So evidence-based, I haven't gone through loads of papers or put loads of papers in the slides, but I'll just kind of talk you through that basically. So the number one impact that has been observed is therapist skills. And for CBT-based SPSR, the main thing is specific skills. So people get way, way better at using specific change techniques. They get much better at introducing them and explaining them. They get much better at troubleshooting potential problems that a patient might encounter when they do them. So if you've done most techniques on yourself, yeah, your experience isn't going to be the same as everybody else's. If you've done it in a group of 20 people and you've all shared your experiences, because that's what happens usually with group SPSR, you share your reflections with the group and you find that everybody's had different experiences. So that's useful in itself, because you realize that not everybody has the same experience, but people get better at implementing change techniques. They get way better at explaining CBT and how it works and how it leads to change. But also it makes an impact on interpersonal skills, more so when it's done in the co-therapist method, but in other ways as well. So, for example, empathic attunement, so actually working out what's happening for the patient in front of us. So if you've been through CBT for yourself, you're often attuned to what the patient may be experiencing and become much better at noticing that. People get much more attentive to the therapeutic relationship, and they're paying more attention to that. And we think this is one of the reasons, as well as flexibility, why people get more benefit from SPSR with the more difficult patients they've got. So the therapist flexibility I've mentioned. So therapist flexibility is a meta competence. People become more creative in the way that they implement therapy. The therapists obviously become more reflective because they've been practicing that self-reflection and wider reflection as part of the process. So also people change their beliefs about themselves. And this is one of the bits where I find doing SPSR programs most satisfying, that people come to really big shifts about themselves, both the person of the self, but also themselves as therapists. And it still surprises me, even kind of doing it after all this time, seeing the changes people make. And I guess if people hadn't had their own therapy and then they do something which is it's akin to therapy in some form, people do make really, really big shifts in there, in how they see themselves, who they think they are, the behaviors that they're engaging in and working at home. So although it's not therapy, people do make some really, really big shifts. One thing to say about that is it was developed as a training method. It wasn't developed as therapy, but over in Dublin, over at Trinity College, where they've integrated SPSR into the syllabus very deeply for quite a number of years, they've been comparing it to people's experience of training therapy or personal therapy, whatever people want to call it. So therapy while they're training. And they're finding that SPSR is people's views are that it leads to bigger shifts, bigger changes, also a bigger impact on knowledge of the model. And I guess part of my hypothesis around this is when people have their own personal therapy, it doesn't have that bridge in it that leads to, so if you're doing training therapy, personal therapy, and you have a session, you then don't have a session where you go, okay, well, what does this tell me about myself as a therapist? What does this tell me about therapy? What might I do differently? You have the self-practice, well, you have the practice, but you don't have the self-reflection. And I guess what hasn't been done so far is looking at what impact does training therapy have if it is actually followed by that reflective component. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And just these some potential reading. So the first book is the CBT workbook that James and I wrote. The second book is a book I wrote with Bev Harhoff, just looking at reflection in CBT. It's an edited book, so there's chapters by different people looking at how to reflect on patient feedback, how to reflect on supervision, how to integrate reflection into training when you're planning it. This third book just came out, I think it was last year or the year before. And it's not CBT specific. It's written by some colleagues over in India. It's broad. It's great. And then the last book has a CBT chapter by us, but it's also got chapters on for people who are interested in reflection in systemic therapy or across other modality-based models. It's a little bit old now, but if you're interested in how reflection may differ in different therapy approaches, that might be interesting. So I think that was my last slide. So I don't know if we want to take questions now or whether Natalia goes straight into hers and we take questions afterwards. What do you think will work best, Maggie?
Probably at the end, if you don't mind staying with us. I guess it depends what your preference is and whether you need to rush off somewhere.
No, as long as I walk my dog head off before 7:30, he'll be happy. So yeah, I'm happy to wait, and Natalia and I can answer questions together.
That would be marvellous. Thank you very much. So Natalia, would you like to come in now, our own leading light for the region on SPSR? So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Maggie. I will just echo what Richard said firstly, because I trained as a counsellor originally, and it was very much encouraged to have your own therapy as part of the counselling course. And I must admit, I don't think that element particularly improved my skills as a therapist. It was helpful for other ways, and to, maybe not take things personally in therapy and that kind of thing, but it didn't make me more skilled as such as a therapist. And I think having done self-practice, self-reflection, that really has enhanced my skill, I think, and I continue to do it with my work now. Both what Richard was saying about the kind of after reflection, where you're reflecting after a session, either on your own or with colleagues or in supervision, but also during, when you capture an emotion when you're with a client and you're working on your own processes in the session at the same time as keeping the session going. And that can be really difficult to manage when you're training, but also the more you do it, the more skilled you'll become as a therapist. So I really encourage you to do that as much as you feel able to do. So I'll just bring up my slides. Okay, can everyone see those?
That's great.
Hopefully.
You might want to put it into slideshow view though, that's the only thing.
Oh, perfect. Oh. Okay.
Great.
Great, lovely. Okay. So I just wanted to give you all a chance really to have an experience of doing this yourself. So I'm going to talk you through something that actually Richard talked me through on a training that I did with Richard, and I found it really, really helpful. So I asked Richard if I could pinch it to do with you today. So I'll talk through it, and Richard, do chip in if I haven't explained anything or if you think it could be explained better.
Okay.
But basically, this is kind of based on cognitive behavioural therapy, but I think I can explain it in a way that will hopefully be accessible and useful for all of you. So I'd like you to kind of think of a work situation either with a colleague or with a client of yours or something recently which provoked a strong emotional reaction. So sometimes it's easier to remember something that caused you anxiety or anger or something, but equally if something made you feel extremely happy, you could also reflect on that. And then reflect on what do you think went through your mind to evoke that emotional response at the time. And then think about how that felt both within your body and how you responded. So if you want to, you can just kind of stay that with that bit in the white section there. But an extra kind of element that I really liked is to also kind of think about this grey area, which can be a little bit more tricky and more triggering as well to some extent.
Natalia, I don't know if it's everybody's, but my slide's stuck on the first one.
Oh, is it?
Ah, yes.
Yeah, same for me. It's still
Okay.
on the first one.
Oh.
I don't know why it's not changing.
Strange, unless I've got two of them. One sec. Does that work?
Ah, there we go. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. I had two open at the same time. So think about a recent work situation that triggered the strong reaction. What you were thinking at the time. So what do you think drove that emotion? How did it feel? And how did you respond? Then the bit that I was just going to talk about, which I find really useful, is to think, actually, why did I get that strong emotional reaction? It probably comes from some kind of experience from the past. So I'll talk to you about an example so that you can then maybe think about your own kind of example. So just something hypothetically. So for example, if you had, say, two very academic, high achieving parents who had very high expectations of you, and you struggled at school, you might have developed certain self-schema or otherwise known as core beliefs about I'm stupid. If you then go on to train to be a therapist or psychologist or whatever you are in the workplace, if you carry that kind of assumption with you, you might think I have to get everyone to recovery, otherwise I'm a failure, or I have to work at 150% all of the time, otherwise people will find out that I'm stupid. You might then get experiences that almost, because we all have the thinking biases, they almost might, what's the word, kind of enhance that kind of belief, I guess. So you might have an experience, say that a client says they're not happy with a session, or somebody asks what you're doing and why. And instead of thinking, oh, they just want an explanation, you might think, oh no, they're going to presume that or see that I'm stupid, or they don't like me, they're going to see that I failed. So therefore, it might play out very quickly in a situation that you get those automatic thoughts. Hopefully, can you think, I don't know if there's any of the things that you'd add to that, Richard, or whether you think that's enough.
And the only other example I think of is that I see a lot in supervisees is people that have grown up with experiences of needing to put the needs of other people first, or care for other people, or take responsibility for other people, and how that kind of then feeds into beliefs about therapy, and that kind of therapist perfectionism that can lead to burnout, where people try to think they have to do everything for every patient has to get better. And I think that's probably fairly common across therapists and psychologists.
That's a really good point, actually. Thanks, Richard, because I think one of the things that I've really encouraged with self-reflection is, like you were saying, is to really prioritise it and make it quite a robust part of your course or your team, because otherwise, you, as therapists, you're very likely to kind of look after everybody else and put your own needs to the back. So if I give you maybe sort of 5 or 10 minutes to try this on yourself, and try to, if you can, kind of, even if you write it down on paper, write down some notes or something, and then I'll check in and see how you're getting on in 5 or 10 minutes.
Would you mind just explaining the task for us again?
Yeah, sure. So it's just completing this grid, so you can draw it out yourself on a piece of paper, but it's looking at a recent situation where you were emotionally triggered, so a strong emotional reaction. So it might be anxiety, it might be anger, it could even be something happy. It's thinking about what went through your mind in that situation that you think might have triggered the emotion. How did it feel in your body, and how did you respond in that moment? And if you want to, you can go through these grey boxes here, where you think of early life experiences. So were you influenced in your early life to establish or develop certain core beliefs or schema? So the example I gave is highly academic parents that expected a lot of you, and you were struggling academically. You might have a self-schema of I'm stupid. So think about any early life experiences that might have made you feel a certain person or a certain way, and then think about how that plays out in your therapist role or in your psychology role that might have led you reacting in that way in your work situation. And if you want to, you can also think of past experiences that you've had that have made you believe in that particular assumption or schema even more. So for example, we often hold a thinking bias where we remember the 1 or 2 clients that were upset with us, but we don't remember the other ones because we've got this kind of underlying belief that we're stupid or a failure or something. Does that make sense, Maggie, to you?
Yeah, it does.
Great.
Thank
I'll
you.
check in about 5 or 10 minutes and see how people are getting on.
Thank you.
Okay, if anyone can just maybe pop in the chat whether you'd like a couple more minutes or whether you're finished. Thank you. Anyone else need a couple more minutes? Okay, lovely. Great. Okay, lovely. So just what I'd like to do is just spend a moment reflecting together. So just have a think on your own first off, just how that felt to actually spend some time reflecting on your own experiences. I think often we're very much kind of, as therapists and psychologists, very much reflecting on other people's experiences, lots and lots and lots, and we don't often have the time to sit and actually think of, you know, our own emotional responses and what maybe went through our mind and where did that come from and could I have acted differently. So sometimes it's really worth kind of spending that time just reflecting a little bit more, and you can come up with some kind of quite useful things quite quickly if you do this. So I'll open this up to you sharing reflections in a moment, and maybe me and Rich can answer questions and think with you about that. But I just want you to take a moment to write down any action points that you've got from that that you'd like to take forward personally. So it might be to carry on doing this. You might want to put a little note in your diary on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon just to check in with how you're feeling and why you might be feeling that way if you want to do anything about it. It can be in, as Richard was saying, quite flexible. It can be in lots of sort of little ways that you do some reflections on yourself, or it can be in a bit more of a formal way as well. So also it might be worth kind of having a think about whether you'd like to take SPSR forward as part of your team or part of your kind of, whether you're on a course or whether you're part of a team. Just have a think about, could you do this in more of a robust formal way as well? Because what we know is the more you engage in it, the more benefit you'll get from it, but it can be so easy to prioritize other things. So if you do it in a more robust way, you're much more easily able to kind of get the benefits from doing this. And just make a note, if you want to bring anything back to your team after today, just make a little note in your diary or something to make sure that you do raise it with your team at the next team meeting or something to discuss ways forward with it. Right, I'm just kind of aware of the time. I'm just going to whiz through a couple more slides with you, and then I'll open it up to some questions before the end. So as I said, the more you kind of experience SPSR, the more you'll get benefits, but there are certain things that affect your ability to engage in SPSR. And it's things like feeling safe, having personal resources around you, because you're basically not far off being your own therapist. So you're going to come across your own triggers and vulnerabilities by doing this. So it's important that you feel safe and you have someone to talk to. Also making it kind of a requirement and make it more robust will probably improve the likelihood that you're going to engage. I'll talk you through some of the benefits. I think Richard has gone over most of them already, so I'll keep that brief. And as Richard said, again, being part of a group process, you're much more likely to learn from 20, 30 people doing it than just doing it on yourself, because we're all going to come to things very differently and have different experiences, much like your clients will. So it will give you the flexibility to do those skills a little bit differently. So basically, often we'll avoid because it's much safer to avoid. So it's important to keep yourself safe, establish some ground rules as your team or workplace, talk about confidentiality. You only have to talk about the process, not the content. So for example, you can talk about what got in the way of you doing activity scheduling and what you're going to do to approach that and what you need to bear in mind with clients. You don't have to talk about exactly what activities you were doing in your week. Same as thought diaries, you know, what helped, what didn't help, but you don't have to talk about the exact thoughts or core beliefs you were working on if you don't feel comfortable to do so. I find it useful to have someone to talk to and an alternative route if things get too tricky, or if you can do something a little bit less intense, just so that you still are on board and engaging with something and you don't get tempted to completely avoid if it's becoming difficult. And ensure that you have a personal safety strategy. So that will be things like making sure that you talk to your friends, your partner, maybe a peer on a regular basis, set some time aside to do that. If things become difficult, know where to go to. Is it going to be your supervisor, manager? Do you have an SPSR lead you can talk to and drop in to see them? If things become really difficult, of course, and very triggering, you might want to talk to your GP or access your own therapy. The benefits of having this as more of a group process rather than just individually is it normalizes difficulties in learning skills, rather than you feeling you're on your own with not understanding something, and you can share problem solving ideas. You can learn individually about what has worked in particular in certain skills, and tweak skills and learn from each other how to be flexible with the skills that you're sort of giving to your clients. It can normalise our own mental health experience as well. Just because we're therapists and psychologists doesn't mean that we're immune to having low mood and anxiety. So I think it's really good to, if you feel comfortable, to share some experiences and normalise those. Also, it can increase your bond as a team, and I've certainly felt, I've been rolling this out at the University of East Anglia for a couple of years now, for about, I think this is about the 6th cohort that I've done this on, and I think it's really helping the groups bond together, and they feel safe the more that they do this. And you can just gain support from each other when you're going through difficult times as well, with the personally or with your clients, or when clients are particularly triggering for you. Richard's already kind of gone through this already, so it's just maybe thinking about how you're going to do this. Do you need a peer group space? Do you want to work in small groups or pairs? Research has shown that blogs are quite useful because you're just, you know, actually writing that down, reading it through, making sure that you're reflecting on how you bridge that personal learning to your skills as a clinician. So writing it down can be really helpful if you can set up blog groups or something. And I've also referenced the book that Richard referenced as well here. Or you can do it independently in a diary and set yourself tasks if you want. So the book that Richard mentioned earlier is this one, and it's a nice book that you can kind of work through with lots of different ideas of what tasks you can do. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Maggie and the rest of the team, and just to have a little think about maybe how you're going to use this, take it forward, and any questions that you have.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was really great. I had a question, which was about, so you mentioned the book there, Natalia, and just thinking about if somebody came to you and said, I want to start off developing my reflective skills and abilities, what kinds of things would you both say to them to get started?
I mean, I think, you know, the book is really useful, isn't it? I mean, you co-wrote it, Richard, didn't you? So you know the content back to front probably. But that would be a useful starting point. But I'd also talk to supervisors as well, that might have done their own reflection in the past and get ideas from them, what's helpful. Anything else that you'd recommend, Richard, for a starting place for people?
I mean, I think the book is great for people who are particularly interested in CBT, but I guess if people wanted to start, I mean, there's probably some people on this call who either aren't interested in CBT or are even interested in therapy. Maybe, you know, there could be people interested in neuropsych, for example. So there could be a whole range, but I think just getting used to a very, very basic structure of, so not even just practicing a therapy or a technique on themselves, just thinking after a team meeting, after a client session, after supervision, you know, what am I noticing right now? Putting that time aside. I mean, I think we've put it in one of the books, but we've kind of got this, it's really, really simple, just kind of sheet. What did I notice? You know, what went well? What could I have done differently? What will I do differently in future? So I think just training yourself with a few basic questions. So the more you train yourself after, it comes back to Donald Schoen's ideas, the more you can notice after the event, the easier it becomes within the event. So I guess it'd be working out what it is you're wanting to really change, and then just, so I mean, I'm not against people using the book, I'm all for people using the book. I'm even more keen for people buying the book, obviously, but people could start with doing just a very, very simple reflective sheet after either a therapy session, an observation session, a team meeting, whatever it is.
Thank you. That's great. We have a question in the chat, which I think maybe from someone who came a little later to the meeting, but the question is, what particular model of reflective practice would you recommend?
I think it depends what people are wanting from it. I mean, I know it's a bit overused, but I think thinking about the Kolb cycle, I still think it's really, really useful thinking about skill development. We mentioned before the DPR model, if you think about therapist skills development. I think there's kind of a range of models. I mean, I think, for example, some of the CBT based stuff, I mean, it's not a reflective model, but this kind of Safran and Siegel stuff about interpersonal process that has reflection at its core. So I guess, yeah, it's worth thinking what it is, what particular aspect you're looking at. I think for models. I don't know about you, Natalia. Have you got any favorites?
Yeah, the only other one that I quite like is the Driscoll model, which is simply what, so what, now what. And it's really simple, but it's what happened. So what does that imply? What does that mean about me? What does that mean about me professionally? Why does it matter? Why was it important? Why did it evoke that reaction? And then it's now what? So what do I do about it? What do I put into action about this? Either personally, do I need to do something? Or professionally, do I need to tweak something in my practice on the basis of this learning?
Thank you, that's really helpful. I noticed that Anya's put a comment in about education mental health practitioner training, and I'm aware that people attending this meeting may be going into all sorts of different psychological professions, and self-practice, self-reflection is becoming more and more popular in the different psychological professions trainings, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting included in the curriculum for I mean, the CBT therapist curriculum starting to include it much more. But yeah, I think the stuff we've talked about, although we've given largely CBT examples and often more adult focused, this would be equally applicable to any of the psychological professions, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I know, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the model was, but it was taken from medical doctors. And it was a model that we used when I was a CBT therapist for eating disorders. And it was that you talked about your client for 5 minutes, and then you had to be quiet, and other people would reflect for 5 minutes, and you weren't allowed to say anything, so that you had to actively kind of just process and think about what they were saying without your own opinions and kind of getting involved. And then they would stop talking and you would then answer back. But it was really helpful to kind of stop that automatic process where you might disregard something at first and think, no, that's not right, that's not what's happening, because you have to wait and listen to everyone else's views and responses first. So that was for medical doctors, that was a model that they use quite often. So I think absolutely, it's becoming kind of very much well used in lots of different areas.
Thank you. I think unfortunately we've come to the end of the time that we have available to talk. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming to talk to us about reflection and also the benefits and why it's helpful for us, all of us, to become better at reflecting on action, in action. Thank you so much indeed. We are now going to come back to our slides. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you see that okay, Maggie?
Yes, absolutely. That is brilliant. Could you, everybody who's here, please take the time to complete our form to give us feedback about the session? Are you going to put the link in the chat for people to click on?
Yeah, I've just posted it now.
Thank you. Richard said that he's happy for our slides to be shared. That's terrific. Okay, excellent. So if you could just submit those forms, that would be terrific. Our next meeting is on Tuesday, the 26th of September, and we are going to be talking about clinical associate in psychology roles and introducing you to that role. So if you would like to know more about becoming clinical associate in psychology, do come along. There is an Eventbrite link. There it is there on the screen. So do register and come along and find out more about the role.
I've just posted that link in the chat as well so that you can go along from there and register for it.
If you don't belong to the PPN, please do join. It's entirely free. It's a really quick and easy form. It means that you can keep up to date with what we're doing and find out about events that are happening. We have Psychological Professions Week coming up in November. So if you would like to find out more about what's going to be happening nationally and regionally during that week, then do sign up and please join the East of England section so that you can stay in touch with us. That would be terrific. It's completely free and very quick and easy to join.
Thank you, Maggie. And we also just want to let you know that we have created our Psychological Professions Network East of England LinkedIn page as well. So previously we tended to promote this on Twitter, but now we have the LinkedIn page. We can also keep you updated through that. So I will just post a link in the chat for that as well.
And please do connect with us so that you can share the word about the PPN and what we're doing.
I've just put the link in the chat there for everybody. And then finally, we also have some useful resources here. So these are quite general resources and then some more specific to reflection here as well. So I'll just hand over to Maggie to close the session for us.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lara. Thank you to our steering group. Thank you to Emily. Thank you to our fabulous speakers who took the time to join us this evening. Really great to see you all and looking forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Have a good evening. Thank you.